as a military man, was very suspicious of the military-industrial complex, and always suspected that these kind of companies were pushing projects too far and too fast just in order to gain big contracts. His Deputy Defence Secretary then ordered a stop to the X6 and WS-125 programmes in the view that they were just far too ambitious. And I think that was a realistic assessment. So he ordered those programmes stopped and ordered the agency to concentrate on trying to get the engine right.
As a result, the NB-36 flying reactor made its last flight on March the 28th, 1957. It was decommissioned at Fort Worth in late 1957. It was scrapped several months later, with the radioactive parts being buried. It looked like the atom-powered aircraft project was grounded. But then, on December the 1st, 1958, Aviation Week magazine, America's most authoritative defense journal, splashed an amazing story. The Soviet Union had flown an atomic-powered bomber. In fact, Russia had been working in secret on a range of nuclear-powered aircraft for many years.
There was one really wild project they had in the early 50s for a flying boat that weighed 1,000 tons. But the real emphasis of the Soviet military was to keep pace with the Americans and build their own version of a nuclear-powered bomber.
The Soviets already had a long-range strategic bomber. In the West, it was known under its NATO codename, the Bear. But the Bear was too slow to penetrate America's new missile and fighter defenses. Now it appeared Russia was developing a nuclear-powered alternative. It was called the M50. Its NATO codename was Bounder. But how could the Soviets have overtaken America in nuclear-powered planes?
The Soviet researchers into nuclear-powered aircraft paralleled the American ones. They had the same problems to confront. The weight of the reactor, the shielding, and they came up with much the same kind of solutions. The Russians went down the distributed shielding route as well. Curiously, the Soviet figures for the weight and size of the reactor they wanted to fly with is very similar to what the Americans came up with, about 80 tons.
News of the Soviet atom plane success, allied to the successful launch of Sputnik, now changed US policy.
The AEC, the Defence Department, or several Defence Department officials, and the Air Force then threw their weight behind an effort to get the programme back up to the prestige level and the amount of input that it had before, and tried to urge the President to back it so that the Americans could have a plane flying by the early 60s.
President Eisenhower now increased the budget for America's atom plane project. But Eisenhower remained suspicious. He put the accelerated program under management he could trust.
By that time, I had already developed very substantial doubts about its practicality. The goal is a reasonable goal. I mean, an airplane with an indefinite flight time. But the practicality, and I could summarize it in three different areas, all of which are closely related. One is that airplanes are subject to crashing. The idea of flying around with a reactor, which sadly might crash anywhere, is just not something which could be made acceptable. The second point is that especially on the direct drive, or the direct reactor, direct heat, it was inevitable that it would constantly be spewing radioactivity out the tail. And the other one was the pilots. I mean, the question of shielding the pilots was a serious one.
Herb York was a good scientist who knew that they hadn't cracked the four major problems. They still hadn't built an engine that was powerful enough to get the whole shooting match off the ground. They still hadn't solved the major shielding problems. The direct cycle engine was still too dirty to be considered, and the indirect cycle, the technology was simply too immature.
Backed by Eisenhower, York imposed new goals on the project. He cancelled further development of the airframe as being premature. work would concentrate on getting a foolproof engine working. Progress was happening on the engine front. General Electric ran a series of very successful experiments using the direct cycle concept. The engine was running routinely, solely under nuclear power.
The General Electric company were eventually able to get their direct cycle engine working routinely. So the concept was proved. The trouble was they still couldn't crack the weight problem. The plane and the engine still couldn't get off the ground.
While General Electric was working on their direct cycle atomic jet engine, Pratt & Whitney was still working on the indirect cycle. Dr. York thought the indirect cycle approach, which offered the prospect of fewer dangerous leaks of radiation, was the best prospect for a working engine.
However, even with all this renewed vigour in terms of engine research, even by 1959, real progress had been very slow, and a working prototype was not even in sight.
In 1960, the political picture changed again. John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States, beating Eisenhower's Vice President Richard Nixon. Kennedy had accused the Republican Eisenhower administration of allowing the Soviet Union to overtake America in technology and military strength. Was Kennedy going to restart the WS-125 project?
During the presidential election campaign, Kennedy blamed Eisenhower for allowing America to fall behind Russia in military terms. He blamed Eisenhower for what he called the missile gap, that Russia had more ballistic missiles than America, and also for the bomber gap.
But on taking office, Kennedy would discover Eisenhower's last secret. In the closing months of his presidency, Eisenhower had come into classified intelligence about the true state of Soviet military preparations. The new U-2 spy plane and the first space-based reconnaissance satellites had revealed the actual state of Soviet bomber and missile forces.
When Kennedy arrived in the White House, he was in for a major shock. There was no bomber gap. Indeed, it seemed that the Russians had hardly any bombers operational at all. There was no missile gap, and worse still, it appeared they didn't have an atom-powered plane. It seemed that there never had been an atom-powered plane.
The entire Aviation Week story about the Soviets flying a nuclear-powered plane had been a hoax.
There never was a nuclear-powered aircraft. There was a bounder. They built one single aircraft, the M50 Bounder, but it was powered by ordinary jet engines, and it wasn't a very efficient aircraft.
This knowledge now doomed the American atomic bomber project and any prospects of a revival of the WS-125.
All that remained when he became president was research and development on the indirect drive, the liquid metal drive, and even that we're no longer talking about an airplane. So when Kennedy became president, the program was 95% gone.
The atomic bomber was finally cancelled in March 1961, only a month after Kennedy entered the White House.
The surprising thing is that just at the moment Kennedy was cancelling the A&P program, they were beginning to make breakthroughs in reactor materials that would lead eventually to lightweight reactors, particularly that could be used in spaceflight. Today, if you were trying to build a nuclear powered engine for an aircraft, you could probably do so given the technology we now have.
The atom-powered plane had been overtaken by events. The US Navy's nuclear-powered Polaris submarines were becoming operational, and America now had reliable and accurate long-range ballistic missiles. The manned bomber, no matter how powered, had become vulnerable to the anti-aircraft missile. America's flirtation with atom-powered flight was over. But the story of the nuclear-powered bomber had one last secret to give up, the very biggest of all. In the early 1990s, it was revealed that the Soviet Union had flown an atomic-powered aircraft as early as 1961.
Everyone was dumbstruck after the fall of the Iron Curtain, to discover that, after all,